Uh, Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our panel advocating for disability justice. I'm Dr. Jen Rinaldi. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. As an audio description, I'm a white woman with glasses and short brown hair. I'm wearing a green dress today. I think I see some deer and fox and owl print pattern on the dress, and I have a white room and a couch and some plants in the background. I'm an associate professor at Ontario Tech University, and I am the event co-organizer and coordinator. I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. Ontario Tech University is proud to acknowledge the lands and people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island,
Let's see.
First Nation.
Oh, someone has a fun name.
Someone needs to mute themselves. Thank you. We are thankful to be welcome on these lands in friendship. The lands we are situated on are covered by the Williams Treaties and are the traditional territory of the Mississaugas. That is a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation. Which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. We start here because we must be mindful that disability justice work needs to be done in a decolonial way. So welcome. This event is part 4, the final installment of our 4-part virtual speaker series titled Advocates Assembly, Disability Research from the Ground Up. The series has been hosted by the Institute for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, which was established in partnership with Ontario Tech University and the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College. The Institute is committed to conducting applied research that is relevant to policymakers involved in disability and rehabilitation work. And in this vein, the series has been connecting disability researchers to community-based research principles and goals. Across this series, disability justice activists and disability-centered service providers have been speaking to the lived experience, the in-community conditions, and the most pressing needs of disability populations. And we've done so in an effort to frame the future of disability research. This project is funded with a Social Science and Humanities Research Council Connection Grant. We are very grateful to SLIAO for providing ASL interpretation services tonight, and to the Canadian Hearing Services for providing live captioning. Professional artist Rana Awadallah, or Rana the Artist, on Instagram, created original work for our promotional materials. If you want to support a disabled professional artist, you can go check out her work and commission a piece from her. I'll note that this presentation is being recorded and will eventually be available on our Institute website. The chat window is open for engagement. We ask that audience members turn off their cameras and microphones for the duration of the talk itself. And during the question and answer period, you can raise your hand. There's a reaction button at the bottom of the screen. You are welcome to turn on your camera and microphone to pose questions. You can also pose questions in the chat, I do have students who are monitoring the chat who can compile those questions for us at the end. There should be time for a Q&A, either in written or oral form. And that is all I'm meant to say. If the speakers are ready, we might begin the talk. Everyone's feeling good to go? Wonderful. If no one minds, there's a bit of technical pivoting as it's outlined. And I'll just note that we should make sure we're muted as we're listening in as an audience. Okay. So my first question for our speakers is I'd like you to introduce yourselves for me. So you can provide your name, your organizational or institutional affiliation, and maybe as a more fulsome introduction, you can share your contributions to disability and rehabilitation research. So you can situate yourself as scholars or service providers or activists. And if you want to, I'd be grateful if you also provided a description of yourself for accessibility purposes. Who might like to start?
I can start.
Go for it, Sam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Walsh. I'm the National Director of the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, so DAWN Canada. I recently got my PhD from the University of Toronto-Oise in sociology, and the focus of my research was exploring effective, inclusive policy for folks with physical disabilities. Dawn is interested in supporting women, girls, deaf women and deaf girls, as well as gender fluid individuals throughout the life cycle. So we're interested in everything from children to adulthood. And when we think and talk about disability, we think about it from an intersectional perspective and how that informs and changes one's experience of disability. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sam. Great introduction. Chelsea or Ellen, would you like to go next, Ellen? Go for it.
Sure. My name's Ellen. Am I unmuted? Yes. I'm Ellen Cohen, and I'm with the National Mental Health Inclusion Network, formerly the National Network for Mental Health. And we've changed our name because we've been actively involved in work within the disability community to identify and look at the needs of persons with disability, other diverse communities, and the deaf community in regards to their mental health, their addiction needs, and healthcare, we've come to know. So we felt that it was necessary to change our name and move into the disability community in a meaningful way, to have the conversations and provide a platform for mental health within or for people with disabilities, deaf people. And the COVID definitely highlighted, not that mental health services were abundant prior to COVID. So it was a really significant time and opportunity, sadly, for us to move forward within the disability community to provide resources. We do advocacy, education, and we're providing resources formerly from the mental health community, inspired by consumers, and we're bringing it into the disability community. So, and my work within research has been very limited. I worked in a very early project where it was a longitudinal study to work and focus on the development of an infrastructure of peer support organizations across Ontario. And surprisingly enough, it is still alive, and it's a very, it's successful in very many ways. It still provides peer support. So, so that's been limited. However, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks. Oh, and I will describe myself. Not sure if I'm middle-aged. I think I'm older. I'm an older adult. Somebody at a conference last week said she was middle-aged, and I just almost fainted. So I must be ancient. I have brown, blonde, dark blonde hair. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm wearing a gray shawl and a black t-shirt. And I have a white background behind me. Thanks.
Hi, I can take my turn now. Hi, everybody. My name is Chelsea Jones, and the first thing that you might notice is that I'm not Michelle Hewitt. I know some folks were expecting Michelle on the panel tonight, and Michelle is an incredible activist, an incredible researcher, and just a wonderful person. And so I'm stepping in to try to fill her shoes. And that's a difficult thing to do because she is really great. And so hello to Michelle if she watches this later. I hope I can do good by you. I am an assistant professor at Brock University. I teach and research in the field of child and youth studies. And my academic background is in critical disability studies. Brock is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And the territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and it's on land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And geographically, it's near Niagara Falls, so outside of Toronto, near Niagara Falls. That is where I work and where I base a lot of my research. And some of my research is deeply engaged in disability justice, and other parts of it are not. I am a cis white woman, and my pronouns are she and her. And it's my whiteness that positions me outside of disability justice a lot of the time. I am a MAD identified person, and I live in close relation to intellectual disability. My brother is an adult man with intellectual disability. And at the moment, I have a temporary impairment. I have a foot and ankle injury that's been sticking around for about a year and a half. So I'm using crutches to move around. But generally speaking, I'm more likely to identify as a white, sort of non-disabled woman, which puts me in an interesting position in relation to disability justice, because as I understand it, disability justice is a movement and a framework and a seeding place for theory and activism and community building, beginning with those who are most impacted. So queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and disabled people of color, and disabled elders. So there's questions about how I locate myself in the proximity of disability justice and what it means to be sort of in the proximity of this work. And I can talk about those a little bit more as the conversation goes on. I don't need to suck up all the time in the introduction, but that's how I'll position myself for the moment. Thanks.
What a great way into theory and consideration of research already. Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you everyone for your introductions. Maybe it's time to dive right in.
We're just going to be switching interpreters, so off to Jen.
Let's add spotlight. Thank you so much, Amanda. Great. So my first question for the panel is, what should community-based research look like? And that's a question of research from start to finish. My follow-up is, what are some examples from your own experience of challenges or strategies for success? Who wants to start? I see Sam.
I can speak first if that's helpful.
Yeah.
And we can do a bit of a go round. So I apologize, I never did an image description. So I'm wearing a hand knit poncho. No one can see because we're on Zoom, but I use a wheelchair. and the back of my background is blurred because my apartment is messy. But thinking about effective ways to do community-based research, one of the things that I reflect on both personally and professionally is that often equity-seeking groups are continually consulted or asked for their opinion, often with little compensation rather, and often they don't get to see what happens next, like the end product or the difference it makes. So when I am engaging with people who would normally be understood as stakeholders, I often try to compensate them for the research contributions, or provide support. Additionally, I try to make folks aware of like what is the purpose of the research and what is the hoped outcome. And predominantly I try to root it in policy or community change. I think it's important when thinking about engaging community in research that we recognize that like both there is a fatigue of being a constant curiosity, but also there's fatigue in constantly hoping for better and never seeing the outcome. So making that engagement authentic is something that I reflect on when doing research.
Thanks so much for that start, Sam. I really feel that reminder that research comes with a lot of fatigue, that we're talking about a community that is often over-researched, that is targeted in research. So, you know, making the work meaningful and ensuring that it's connected to outcome seems important for offering a kind of counter to the exhaustion that this community must experience when they're being approached, you know, over and over again with research project proposals. Chelsea or Ellen, would you like to go next?
I will.
Take it away.
I cannot say that I have a vast experience in research. I got turned off very early, understanding that sometimes it's skewed. But I do have something to say. I'm going to share something very precious, and it's from an event that we held in Northeastern Ontario with a regional network, and by a young man named Ridland. He would sit and observe the group and come out with a piece of work that can be shared. And I think this is really important. And it's got to do with everything the way I believe research should be done. I am the evidence. I am the subject matter expert. I am the reason I endure. I am proud of my survival. I give my voice to experience. I give myself to aid suffering peers. I give my time out of love and compassion. I give because lives depend on it. You hear the names of Durjan. You hear very little about our concerns. You hear my name with a blank stare. You hear many things, but what of truth? So if mental health truly existed, would anyone hear the call of the mentally ill in the depths of the forest? Would anyone be around? I possess a heart and soul and big dreams. I possess the skin of a lion and the depth of the ocean. I possess the ability to achieve anything I imagine. I possess skills to self-advocate and stand tall. I know the future will not be worse than the past. I know it will be so if I make it so. I know my friends and neighbors might support us. I know they won't if we don't reach out. But why should I be the teacher of masses? Why won't society come to meet me where I am? But why isn't it always done with us when it is about us? But why do you still change against shackles that bind? Peer support is a branch on the tree that sustains some people of the most succulent fruit. So when a survivor has grown and ripened, once picked, can nourish another's healing. I'm not just an object of diagnosis. I'm not interested in others' scorns. I'm not taking discrimination any longer. I'm not a petri dish for drug labs. We are moving straight forward together. We are stronger than hatred and stigma. We are beautiful souls within nature. We are loud voices in a chorus for justice. My roots, our family, are firmly in my reality. My roots support me as I stand up strong. My roots hold me in place, surrounded with love. My roots cannot be shaken. Here is where I remain. Always remember, I am the evidence. Always remember, I am the subject matter expert. Always remember, I am the reason I endure. Always remember, I'm proud of my survival. Neon's Conference, North Bay, 2007, Gregory Franson. And that's how I feel. That's my orientation to research. It's always been hands-on. There's been an amazing research project that came out of an organization, one of the organizations that we worked with in the Northeast called NISA. And the project was being, becoming, and belonging. And it definitely demonstrates the need for community action research and including people who are involved and the subject matter experts. And thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for providing something precious indeed. You've presenced a survivor's voice in the space, and that really moves me as a member of that community. I'm going to sit with that a moment and maybe let Chelsea take a turn.
Sure. Thanks, Ellen and Sam, for what you've said so far. You know, when I think about this question of what should community-based research look like, it's interesting because I agree. You know, as Ellen and Sam have said so far, some of the messages I'm hearing are including people from start to finish and in meaningful ways. Listening to and adhering to these disability activist mantras of nothing about us without us, and the disability justice mantra of leadership of the most impacted, and forefronting those things, I think is really significant. However, I also think that in the research domain, like in academic research spaces, for example, there are sometimes really prescriptive instructions about what community-based research should look like. And unfortunately, some of those instructions say similar things, right? Like there's sort of this list of good practices, how to be a good community-based researcher, doing things like relationship building and making sure, the research comes from the community and engaging people from beginning to end. And those are all good practices, but they don't always apply, or they can't sort of be. What I'm meaning to say is that often those practices are offered to us through a very normative lens that isn't thinking about disability, it isn't thinking about accessibility, and it isn't thinking about the ways in which community-based practice can often look different in disability communities than it might in other spaces. So if I think back to my like 10-ish years of community-based research, all I can say is that it looks different every time. And if I had one word to describe it, that word would probably be unresolved, because I think it never sort of fits those instructions that emerging researchers are taught about how to do good and ethical research. Sometimes those things don't always work. For example, if you think about the role of research ethics boards at universities. A lot of the criteria that they have historically managed and that researchers have to meet in order to proceed with their research. A lot of that criteria comes from traditional positivist models. I think, for example, about a time that I wanted to do some research with a community group I was already involved in. We're a writing group, and I'd been working with this writing group through community living for a couple of years, and we decided we wanted to write together in a research way. And I had to offer them an informed consent form. This was part of the research ethics protocol. And so, you know, that was all right. We came up with this informed consent form together, and we put it in plainer language that everyone sort of seemed to feel okay about. And I brought it to the research ethics board and I said, all right, this is our informed consent form. Does this work? And they turned around and said, no, if you can't use the university's language, then the people you're working with are not competent enough to participate. And this, you know, created a great deal of tension, right? And it inserted this issue of normative competence into what was, you know, earlier sort of this flexible, dynamic, non-normative writing space. And so I think that there's clashes between how communities understand themselves and how research bodies understand communities. And so when you start mixing community and research, those tensions emerge, and sometimes in difficult ways that call for a lot of working through. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons that we learn in particular from Indigenous researchers about the power of refusal. And I'm thinking of Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang in particular, but there's also something to be said for refusing to take part in research, or instead of, you know, making sure that people are participating from beginning to end, maybe community-based research looks like little bouts of participation, or participating when you can, or sharing only what you want and then retracting other things. Because, you know, not all stories, for example, are meant to be shared. And I think another part of community-based research, or another theme that I've noticed so far, is that disability disappears sometimes in research. And I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, because I think it's okay for disability to sort of remove itself from research spaces. I think that can be an important and sort of resistive thing to do. But there are other times when it's really difficult to sustain community because of the sort of institutional borders that surround us. So again, looking to that same writing group, I remember coming into the group one day, and one of the writers who was normally with us, it was a weekly group, so we sort of saw the same people week after week, just wasn't there. And that didn't seem too unusual, but then a few weeks later, you know, they hadn't shown up, and I asked one of the staff people, you know, where is this person? And they said, oh, you know, he died. And we couldn't tell you because, you know, it was a health issue that was confidential. And so you have these institutional parameters that are set up around community that don't operate in the way that supportive community actually operates, and in fact tends to sort of interfere with community building. And so, you know, if the question is like, you know, what are some challenges? I think one of my biggest challenges in community-based research is trying to decide, is research going to come into this community that we're building and somehow puncture it and somehow interfere with it? Is research going to be a harmful intervention? And so those were some of my thoughts in relation to your question, Jen.
Oh, thank you all. I'm hearing from Ellen these beautiful words that function as themselves a kind of refusal, a refusal to sort of fit into the research frames that are expected of survivors. And Chelsea's laid out some really great examples of how institutional processes, our own structures around research when we're coming out of academic institutions, can be at odds with community-based research principles and like the real work of community building. So that's like a really difficult tension if we want to do community-based research, and we're talking about like how to bring ourselves into community spaces when we might be poison, when we might ourselves be a problem in that space, a kind of hindrance to community building. Really lovely contributions, all three. Would you want to say any final words before we move on to the next question? Anything that struck you from the conversation? Ellen might want to go first. Ellen, the floor is yours.
I do, because of my lack of research knowledge and my experience is limited, Chelsea, I'm really interested. I understand you said it can hurt, because I've seen my experience has been with the mental health community, and that's a very closed community, as we all well know, and they do not understand disability. They think disability is a button or a ramp, and they don't understand what access means other than, you know, well, you can make an appointment. They don't understand accommodation needs. So, and quite frankly, they're not willing really to entertain it. However, our reality is the world is changing, our government's changing things as well. One of my issues and my concerns is the mental health research that's coming out. We've formed the mental health disability COVID and beyond subcommittee, and it's the National Mental Health Inclusion Network's subcommittee. We came together after Minister Qualtrough's disability advisory group had no mental health participant. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. We need to be, and I fought to be on there, and I did eventually get invited, because honestly, everybody's coming out with these frameworks, and throughout the mental health community, they're coming out with frameworks for developing apps for mental health and addiction, like, and not being inclusive, not making sure that there's LSQ, ASL. And one of my big problems has been my lack of knowledge about research and how we get a mental health lens on disability, on the deaf community. There's an article here or there. A colleague of mine, a hero of mine from the mental health community, Patricia Deegan, says, you know, one of the things we need is personal medicine. And I know that throughout my years in mental health, and it's been over 30 years, I've come to know that I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry, but it's not good. It's not easy to find the information you need. Patricia Deegan did write an article on mental health in the deaf community, and we have perfect examples of some of our colleagues who have had severe problems with the mental health community. One of our colleagues who was from the deaf community, his wife was a deaf teacher. She suicided the first June of COVID, because her, you know, and she's gone for help. And that's one of my big needs is huge gap in research around mental health, addiction, and disability in the deaf community, and marginalized, all of it. They don't care. And that's one of the things that we are looking at doing and moving forward with. But it's difficult when you don't have a research background. You don't know the questions to ask. You don't know. I do understand the tension between the university and the institution but there's a way you can always work around it. I truly believe that. So thanks. I'm learning a lot, guys.
And you're teaching a lot, Ellen. I'd say that there's a real call here to ensure that disability is not treated like a monolith, and that we're not excluding people from the category disability when we're thinking about how to orient research in a way that improves lives and doesn't miss people, doesn't have people fall through the cracks in the process. Thank you so much, Ellen, for that follow-up. Any other follow-ups before we push ahead? I think Chelsea has a thought.
Yeah, I just okay. I thought I was on mute. Thanks, Ellen. It's really exciting to hear about the research that you're doing. And I think, some of the things that you're saying remind me that yes, research is very institutionalized, but I think that's a really certain type of elitist research, actually, that is institutionalized. And what Indigenous researchers tell us again and again is that their work is often rooted in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous world making that has been around for a long time before it was co-opted by institutions and before it was surrounded by certifications and formalities that make one a researcher or not. And so I think this, I'm just really interested in what you're saying, because I think it raises questions about who are knowledge producers, who is allowed to be a researcher, who's allowed to be a knowledge producer. And we know that communities hold lots of knowledge, right? Communities come with lots of knowledge and hold lots of knowledge already. Research in its formal institutionalized form is not always the best or even a good intervention. And so to me, there's almost questions here, not about the research machine, but more about knowledge production and what can we do in the vein of disability justice that supports the generative, vibrant, flourishing knowledge production, including that which you just described. So that's all I have to say in response. Thanks.
Wonderful. It's starting to sound like our academic institutions are not meant to guide research so much as catch up to the knowledge that's already being generated in community. And maybe we leave it there, unless Sam, you have any final thoughts. Maybe we'll move on to number. You do?
No, the second prompt, the next prompt is fine.
You might be my lead for the second prompt, which is what should academic disability research prioritize in order to meaningfully meet community needs and expectations? So it's really a question about content, where we need our research to go right now. What are the pressing needs at the moment?
I think that's a great question. I think it builds really well on the discussion we were just having. So one of the things that I'm constantly reminding many folks, not just researchers, is the idea that disability doesn't happen in a vacuum. So often a critique I have of literature that is produced about the experiences of folks with disabilities, regardless of type of disability, is people with disabilities are often disengendered. So you can either be a disabled person, or you can have gender, or you can have race, but you can't be a disabled person with a race and a gender. And I think often, sorry, let me rephrase this. I think something to keep in mind when building on research or creating research is the idea that intersectionality is not just the stacking of identities for the sake of stacking identities. So if we're thinking of Kim Cranshaw's original work on intersectionality. It's the idea that like my experience of being disabled is informed by my race identity, is informed by my gender identity. And my experience of disability as a white woman is going to be very different than someone who is racialized or someone who's Black. And that is something to keep in mind. I think additionally, and the other speakers have touched on this, the concepts of cross disability work. So the idea that like, just because I use a wheelchair doesn't mean that I'm not necessarily going to be engaging with discussions around mental health or addiction, or like having a physical disability may not be my only way into the space, in the same way that like folks with other disabilities or who identified as disabled are going to have these complex, rich experiences, and you don't just get to be one thing. I think additionally, there's also, and this builds on kind of what I was saying earlier in the discussion, moving away from research for the sake of research and engaging with that community around like what are the priorities here? What is the actual need? Like, for example, there's lots of work and literature, and of course, because I'm at a public speaking event, I can't remember any of it, that illustrates the importance of peer support, the importance of engagement from the community with the community, and that lived experience piece becomes so important and is something that needs to inform research, as opposed to having a research body be that paternalistic space. It's like, we're going to do something on disability in school or disability in healthcare. Like, what are the actual needs from the community? And that is my piece.
Thanks so much, Sam. It sounds like I'm really happy my students have come to this talk, because all three of you have used names and concepts that come from my courses. So it sounds like we can't do disability research anymore without thinking about complexity. We'll miss really key truths if we don't look at the ways in which oppression is a compounded experience. I think it's a really great place to start, especially given that the theme of today was disability justice. And I think justice work can't really be done in silos, has to be done in solidarity. Thanks so much for always leading, Sam. Chelsea or Ellen, do you want to go next?
I will. Somehow I don't feel that I can really respond to this, but I think it's really important to really hear the disability community. When I think about intersectionality, I think it's like peeling, when I explain it, it's like peeling an onion. And I'm explaining it to people in the mental health community. They do not understand intersectionality. It's really sad. They don't understand the diversity. They understand complex as, okay, well, you have an addiction and you have a mental health issue. They don't, in the mental health community, it's very siloed. And I sit there at those tables and they talk about research, and now they're talking about a report card. Well, it's interesting because all of this money is coming out into the mental health community and the addiction community, 4.5 billion. And there's so much that needs to be done for everybody. And, you know, so what is it like? A priority for me is the mental health question around people with disabilities. We know that 22% of Canadians have disabilities, and of that, 45% also have mental health conditions. And people don't understand that. They don't, you know, so for me, that's a priority that we need to really understand. And for me, and the reason I sort of went in between you two is because I think we need to have a consumer perspective, because we need the research done, and people are suffering and people are dying and people are signing up for MAID because they're tired of living in poverty. And mental health community, very many of our folks live in poverty and they can't get out of it. You know, their jobs, we all know that employment is an issue. We can all work when we're well. And so that's my, I hope it's helpful. And I really hope that we can move forward and get some really excellent research. And my methodology is not, it's more of a participatory model.
Well, Ellen, I'm really grateful that you brought up medical assistance in dying. It is an issue that is popular in my faculty as a target of study right now. And I feel like even then, people keep missing that the most important part of that conversation is how disabled people are seeking assistance because of the conditions they live in. Conditions that we could address through policy. What an urgent and pressing matter in disability research. And we see people entering into this area of research only talking about autonomous decision-making and missing the whole forest. That feels like an incredibly urgent issue that research could be focusing on right now, and specifically focusing on why people are seeking out death.
And can I just add something? It's ludicrous because doctors and psychiatric systems are the only systems that can legally detain you against your will, drug you against your will, and 6 months later, if you choose to have medical assistance in dying, they can invite a new doctor to come in and assess you for medical assistance in dying. It's ludicrous, and they can't be doing this until they change mental health law. And yeah, and I just needed to add that because people don't know that, and they don't understand the position that people who are vulnerable and people with mental illness. We're not talking about privileged people. We're talking about our folks.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I might turn over to Chelsea if you have some thoughts.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to try to pick up what you're saying, Ellen, and to stick with this line of thought about MAID and research in relation to MAID. And I think it's a big thing to think about. And Ellen, I hear what you're saying, right? You're talking about the community's needs. You're talking about consumer perspectives. And one thing I'm gathering is, that this is, we're talking about people who are the most impacted by this legislation and by decisions made around the possibilities of this legislation, including how it is in place now and how it may or may not be expanded. And so it's so incredibly important to capture that and also engage with it in particular ways that fit the community, right? And those may or may not be disability justice oriented ways. When I think about the origins of disability justice, for example, it's easy to, I shouldn't say easy, it's possible to go online and to Google the 10 principles of disability justice. And, they were written by Patty Byrne and Sinzin Valid in, I think, around 2005, and they're readily available. And it's so possible to say, you know, a great way to proceed with research is to follow these 10 principles. But I also think that research, as it relates to disability and disability justice, needs to be context specific. And these principles, while relevant and applicable, come from a movement based in the San Francisco Bay Area of the United States. So a really different cultural context than the context up north, where MAID is now happening, right? Where MAID is now possible and happening. And even insofar as, you know, what does decolonial disability justice look like, or what does decolonial research look like? That ranges from community to community in some cases. And so I think, you know, that the research about topics that are of great concern to our communities and to our people, really, you know, that research needs to be led by people, needs to be led by the most impacted. And when I say that, I'm echoing disability justice, but I'm also turning away from its principles a little bit, because I do think that research needs to be context specific, and contexts are always changing. They're never static. And there's always, you know, different needs and different stories arising in different places. A lot of my research actually takes place in Saskatchewan on Treaty 4 territory. That's where I'm from. It's not where I live now, but it's where I'm from. And one of the things that we grapple with when we think about our research, which is arts-based disability research, is the difference between the disability arts movement in urban areas like Toronto and Vancouver, and the strength of those movements compared to the same movements in Saskatchewan, which is sometimes called the flyover province, or the flyover part of Canada, because it's a little bit ignored. So what does it mean to be doing the same thing, but in a different place? And I think that your concerns around MAID are so relevant to context-specific research, because disability justice-driven research is going to look different and be different in a country where MAID is happening than it may be in a country where MAID is not happening.
Wonderful. So I'm hearing from this discussion that the kind of research that can be done in this field needs to be complex, needs to consider intersectional oppressions, and needs to be grounded in the very particular contexts that these communities find themselves in. Those are really great tips for how to particularize our research, how to make sure it's not, if it's grounded in community, then it has to have its anchor points. We can't lose the details. Is it okay to push ahead to the last question? So we have a bit of time for the Q&A. Thank you, everyone. My last question for you is, how can disability and rehabilitation research communicate findings to key stakeholders in ways that advance public policy and produce meaningful transformation? I might lean on Sam again, who's so good at opening discussions.
Jen, can you just read the question aloud one more time?
For sure. How can disability and rehabilitation research communicate findings to key stakeholders in ways that advance public policy and produce meaningful transformation?
Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I wanted to make sure I had the wording right before I go off. So at DOM, we often have the refrain that we are not stakeholders, we are partners. So the idea of ensuring that there is like an equitable relationship between the researcher and the community, again, tying back to themes of what I talked about before, having equity and compensation within the research, I think, again, when we're thinking about communication and research dissemination, we're also thinking about, like, it builds back to making sure the research is relevant and of interest to the community and of the moment. So I think that is important. And when we're doing work that informs policy, making sure that research gets in front of the folks who are in fact writing the policy or creating the policy is really important. And something that I'm called to think about as an academic who now spends a lot of time in the non-for-profit and advocacy spaces with a pan-Canadian organization, shifting to make sure that research that is produced by community groups, quote unquote gray research, is also positioned and disseminated appropriately, because often what ends up happening is you'll have this fantastic community-based work or documents produced, and they won't necessarily get in front of the folks who are changing laws, changing policies, things of that nature. I also think that another key piece with making research relevant to partners or stakeholders is including narratives or discussion within those key findings. So I think this panel has been a really interesting example where Ellen was able to capture the crux of the issue with a narrative. And I think those sort of individual stories are really important to couple with research. And I think if we're reflecting as well on the topic of MAID, I think, or I like to think, this is a very charitable illustration, that those who are thinking about MAID have a very abstracted understanding of disability, but when we bring it into the narrative, to the lived experience piece, it becomes this very complicated issue that begs the question of like, what is free choice, what is uncoerced choice? So using that as an example to connect narrative and research should always be coupled together. So many words to say that it should be rooted in community need, lived experience, and the dissemination needs to be put in front of folks who can actually create change.
I think this piece about narrative feels like pretty important. This we think about the methods we use as researchers to communicate the knowledge we're gathering, and you know, there are methodologically rigorous approaches that don't always get at the soul or the story to the research. Narrative is a way of framing like how what we're studying affects real people, and narrative is probably a really effective way of communicating our messages to ensure that we have some kind of meaningful impact. Because how do you move people to change policy? How do you move people to make meaningful transformation? You probably need to like get at their hearts. Thank you, Sam. Ellen or Chelsea, would you like to go next? Do we have an order now? Is it Ellen next?
I'll go. I was part of a research, a longitudinal research in Ontario around the development of an infrastructure of peer organizations that lasted from 1991, and the creator never thought that it would last beyond the 5 years, beyond the longitudinal study. It's still around. There are many organizations in Ontario that deliver peer support in a meaningful way, despite the fact that it's been a little bit co-opted, but that's okay. It's still there and it still works. I forgot what I was going to say, but you know, providing the information out to community is really, really important. And all too often, things are shelved. They'll do a research, a new government will come in, there's a new research. If we looked on our shelves, I'm sure we would find solutions from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's very, very sad, because I know in mental health, they spend lots of money on research, and it's really important that we share that the findings of our research with people who do make the decisions, and government. And, you know, when you have conference, invite them. You know, that's what Dawn just did with, they've been working on an amazing project, more than a footnote, for, I guess, 5 years. And it's important, as well as, you know, the CRW, the employment plan. My brain's not working. It's CCRW. They just had their conference. They're in the middle of their conference, actually. And, you know, but that took, you know, our employment strategy took, you know, Maureen Hahn going to Geneva to say, oh, the UNCRPD committee said, oh, you don't have an employment strategy for disability. And boom, there was money. They had a round table, and they're moving forward with it, just as Dawn is, more than a footnote. So these are the kinds of things we need to be introducing. I was part of a $1 million public my words. It was a project, and it was a public awareness project in Northeastern Ontario, and it included CAMH, CMHA, NEON at the time, the Northeast Ontario Consumer Survivor Network, and the hospital. And, you know, at the end of the day, it was an amazing, amazing piece of work and a piece of research. And it touched the heart of the key influencers in the Northeast, from government, police, first responders. We had people talking about their own experience. It was a consumer's experience along with the service provider, and people shared, police chiefs and unbelievable doctors shared their personal experiences in a very intimate, you know, setting, where we were sharing about mental health issues and the stigma and the discrimination. And at the end of it, it got shelved. We found money to be able to continue that, because we were using honorariums for our survivors who were presenting. And we found money. And when we found the money, they said, but it's not yours. They asked everyone who wants to take it. We said we would. And when we did find the money, they said, you can't have it because nobody knows who it belongs to. You know, these are the kinds of things that consistently happen in the consumer movement, whether it's mental health or disability. So that's all I got to say, but thank you so much. This has been an amazing, you know, experience.
I agree. What a robust conversation. I'll note that, like, you've highlighted some really key obstacles to, like, how research could actually translate into meaningful transformation, one of which is that our funding runs out. So how do we make anything long-term or lasting or sustainable? And the other is that government priorities change because governments lose interest or turn over to new parties. So it's really hard to sustain interest and to keep people's attention and focus when they, you know, hold the levers of power.
I just have one more thing to say. I'm really sorry, but we need to impart to our governments, across all government, that health and disability and our lives are not political issues. They need to stop doing that. And I don't know how we do that.
I really appreciate that call. Thank you, Ellen. Chelsea, would you like to close off this discussion?
Sure. Yeah. I'm just all the things people are saying are sort of moving around in my mind, and I'm really enjoying this discussion as well, and just trying to let it sink in a little bit. I'm going to go back to part of the discussion that you punctuated, Jen, about narrative. And I'm thinking about Sam's comments and Ellen's comments, and they're reminding me that another important piece of knowledge production is understanding the narrative behind policy. Like, how did we get to these policies, and understanding that there is a history there and a trajectory there. I find sometimes, especially in teaching, when students come in with a research project, they sort of, they do sometimes do what Sam has expressed, where they sort of pluck disability out of a line of issues and say, I'm going to study this. And it comes with a sense of entitlement, as if A, disabled folks want to be objects of research, and B, that they are eligible to be objects of research, and that anyone is entitled to just learn from them whenever they please. And these are really dangerous assumptions that are coming, I think, in part from structures that teach us that disabled folks are objects of research. And we're sort of fed two messages. One is that disabled people are underrepresented in research, and so we should learn more about them, which is not true. Disabled people have been objects of research for a very, very long time, and often in very harmful ways, and often in eugenic ways that have led up to the current policies that we are talking about now and that we are thinking about. And I will again point to you, Jen. For those of you who might not be in the know, Jen Rinaldi is a leading researcher on institutionalization in Ontario, and has a portfolio that just elevates the kind of narratives that we need to understand the ways in which institutionalization has shaped our context and has shaped the lives of people with disabilities in this province and in Canada. It's extremely, extremely important work. So I think the narrative of policy is somehow connected to the personal narratives and to researchers' assumed entitlement to them. And so we need to be critical of that and also cautious of it. I also think that research has a responsibility to share the knowledge that it has collected with the communities that it comes from, because that's community knowledge, not researcher knowledge. And so in my work with folks with intellectual disabilities in particular, there are questions about knowledge translation that come up. For example, I can give you an example that I hope ties together both things I'm trying to say. So I do some research with some of the folks who are in a broadcast media production program at Humber College. My background is in journalism, so I know a little bit about that. These are folks with intellectual disabilities, and we make podcasts together. And Humber College is a really interesting place if we're thinking about, context-specific research, because it's a place where there used to be a psychiatric institution where people used to be institutionalized. And there's an artist that I work with quite often named Anne Zabitnu, and a lot of her work involves memorializing the unmarked graves of people who died at that institution. So there's a history of research and work already there. For example, in 2015, Anne collaborated with a psychiatric survivor group called Among Friends, and they created 1,511 paper lilies, and they put them into the ground at Humber College to represent these unmarked graves. So this knowledge production is happening, right? If we think about sort of co-constituting knowledge, there's already projects going on, community-based project, community knowledge that's growing in this space. And then in I come as a researcher wanting to make a podcast with some of the students. And the students know this history, right? They know this history. They understand that at a different time in a different era, in this same space, they would have been taken up quite differently, quite likely as patients, right? And so as patients who would have been the objects of research, right? So there is there's this contextual history at work. There's this sort of narrative of policy that's bringing us to where we are. But at the same time, all right, so we come in and we do this podcast. Anne and I are working on it together. We create the podcast. It goes pretty well. There's a lot I could say about the podcast, but I don't think I need to dwell on it. But then we decide, all right, we're going to write about what happened with this research and what we did. And how can we write about this in a way that the podcasters could read the writing or have the writing and understand it and use it for whatever they want to use it for? And so we decide to try to write in plain language. We get some guidance on this and we try to publish it. And we're told again and again, it's not up to academic standard. So this ableism creeps in at the end of the research process, right? So eventually we were able to advocate for a book chapter that's written in plain language. But we had a lot of trouble. We got slapped on the wrist many times by the editors who were telling us we were doing it wrong. We really had to push it through. And there were a couple of times when I thought of pulling out because it was a really difficult project. But we decided we'd give it a try. And will it ever end up in the hands of the people who made the podcasts, they might be read as stakeholders, for example? I don't know, right? I don't know. And if it does, what can they do with it? And I hope something. But those are sort of the unresolved kind of loose end questions that I think come up at the end of these projects. And to Jen's point, the funding runs out. So the resources that might enable us to answer those questions or explore them more deeply sometimes seem to dry up. And that's kind of the unresolvedness that I'll stop with.
I do love ending a talk on a note of unresolvedness. That sounds exactly right for disability justice work. With only 15 minutes or so remaining, I did want to provide some space if you have any final thoughts before we transition into a question and answer period. Any final notes that you might have missed saying? Are you ready for a Q&A? I really am grateful to you all for such a rich discussion. I'm going to turn over to our audience. We have some time remaining before 7:30. If you have any questions you want to ask one or all of our speakers, I can scroll through the chat. Let's see if I missed any. And if you want to pose the question yourself, you are welcome to raise your hand and/or turn on your microphone. I think maybe I'll note to our speakers that we've had some requests for some of these project links. If you want to add them to the chat at all. I've been trying to do some keep up work myself. Someone's asking how you can access the podcast, for instance, Chelsea. Peggy might have a thought that I can read aloud, and then I'll turn over to Carolyn. I agree that honorariums are needed. My time is valuable and should be credited. E-gift cards are a wonderful way to honor people with lived experience, especially when living in poverty. With Ontario's Disability Support Program, or ODSP, or CPP disability, the key issue is to remember that we are people first. I like to point out when presenting, just remember you can be disabled by an accident and be in the same boat as me. Thank you so much, Peggy, for that note. It seems really important if we're going to do work in community that we're not extracting knowledge and exploiting the labor that entails without any due compensation. Caroline, so lovely to see you. Would you like to pose your question yourself? Can't wait to hear it.
Sure, without my face. Thank you. This has been an amazing discussion. And my question's in response to Chelsea, but you probably all have answers to it. Yeah, I'll stop with the disclaimers. But Chelsea, you were talking about like it's not enough to have the research be accessible to the communities who partook in like making it, but also like that what your translation of their thoughts can be useful to them. And I was wondering if you have any examples of what that's looked like in the past or could look like. Like, how do you imagine research that's coming from a community going back to the community and then being used by that community in like a productive way? And if that made no sense, because I haven't done academia in a long time, just ignore it and jump to the next person.
Caroline, it's so nice to hear from you. To be honest, I might need a minute to think about an example. I think I could try to jump in and improvise, but if that question is for other people on the panel as well, and they have a more concrete example in this moment, I might pass to them. But I can sure give it a shot if that would be better.
That is fair. Anyone else want to jump in on this question to start?
I'm not sure if this answers it, but I've sometimes had the experience where like talking through someone's experience or them sharing a narrative, and then I will provide language around a term, and then they'll be like, yes, this is what I'm talking about. So the examples I can think of are things like lateral violence. So the idea that like, as a person with a disability, I am able to hold biases or prejudice towards other marginalized groups, and often so that has been a term that I've supported people to understand, or like concepts of intersectionality, and sometimes giving names to people's experience can help to build a relationship and a rapport, and further embolden someone to speak the truth.
Thanks so much, Sam. Anyone else want to answer Caroline's question? Any examples come to mind?
I'm sorry, I need her to repeat the question because I didn't really understand it.
Sure, Caroline, do you mind?
Caroline.
Sure, I don't know if it'll be any clearer because I didn't write it down. But thanks, Sam, for that example. I guess I'm like interested in the next step. So you've taken it and like researchified it. But once you translate it back out of researchifiedness, are there examples of it being useful? So basically my question was, once you do your research that comes from the community, you make it academic-y, you translate it back into some kind of form that's accessible to that community that it came from. Do you have examples of how that can be useful to them? Because Chelsea was talking about it not being enough that the research can be read and understood by the community after it's being produced, but that it can actually be used in helpful ways to them after it's being produced as well. And like by them, not for them.
For them, right. Actually, this work that I was doing in Ontario was exactly that. Because of our 5-year longitudinal study, the Ministry of Health in Ontario put more funding into providing peer support, and it would include family peer support. And that was from the work that we've done, the work that we did on the 5-year longitudinal study. So all of the regions across Ontario were provided with more funding after they received the results, and when it was actually when the Canadian government gave provinces funding to create the local health integration networks. So they were also given money from the federal government for mental health and hips and knees. So that's when we used our research from the community to enhance the peer support models across Ontario. Does that answer?
I can. Oh, sorry, Jen.
And now I'm interrupting. I think that answer offers some really great examples, Ellen, and then I think Chelsea might have her own example now. Good job.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for the question, Carolyn. And truly, I It really did stump me because I think that I really think that sometimes research isn't helpful. And as Sam said earlier, it gets put on a shelf. And Ellen said this as well, it gets put on a shelf, and maybe the solutions we're looking for today were suggested 20 years ago by some report that's been shelved. And so in that sense, I think research is so important because research calls us to look back at those histories, right? And to sort of gather some of it and to put the knowledge in one place and to think about it together. But in my recent experience, I think that, and this is counterintuitive to what I like to do because I love to write, but I think that it is the project-based research that has had the most impact, or that has been able to most effectively sort of turn around and do something. So I take, for example, work coming out of Revision, the Center for Art and Social Justice at the University of Guelph. They've done work on relaxed performance, which is a way of making theater and other performance spaces more accessible. And they've done this work with university students. They go in and they train university students on how to make spaces more accessible. And then the students have to put on a public-facing accessible performance. And they learn a lot by doing that. They learn how to tap into disability justice. They learn how to think about histories and traditions of disabled, deaf, mad, neurodivergent art making, and they learn how to make a space accessible from beginning to end. So it's not just about putting on an accessible performance for an audience, it's about thinking about access in all facets of a performance, from the planning to the execution to getting feedback after. And so students then learn this practice and they take it to their workplaces or wherever else. And I've tried to enact this in my own teaching. For example, I did a public pedagogy project about cripping sex education. And in the funding application for the project, the application said, you know, what will students give back to the community? And it was such a fraught question because the students actually don't give anything back to the community. The community knows what it needs. The community can direct the students, but the students are not, that's not the direction of the intervention. The students aren't actually giving back, they're learning from community. So we had community sex educators come in and get students to make these interactive digital sex education tools. One of which, for example, is an open access ASL guide to sex slang. And that idea came from a disability justice activist named Sage Lavelle, who is a deaf queer person in Ontario, who told the students that that's what their community needs. A lot of deaf kids, they learn anatomical signs for body parts, but they miss out on like slang and conversational discourse about sex. And so this is what Sage said the community needed, and the students produced it. And that was kind of the end of it. But it was an output that is being used by community sex educators in the province, which is useful. So to me, like where I struggle is with this sort of expectation of the written academic report about the research, because there is, you know, academic ableism is imbued in that process at that stage in a way that it doesn't seem so heavily imbued when it comes to making a project output that a community could request and could then use. I hope that addresses your question a little bit, Caroline. Thank you for giving me something to think about.
What excellent examples. I feel like you know, the body of your work, Chelsea, is constantly pushing back against the, to borrow Caroline's term, the researchification of disability issues. If we're thinking about how to make things into plain language and how to make, you know, media accessible, and how to not just have a report or a publication after our research is done, because then we're responsible, like we're guilty for ourselves, like creating something in writing that we end up shelving and not getting back to. Thank you so much for posing a question. I'm so glad you're here, Carolyn. And I do see a comment in the chat from Matt saying, I'm not sure how we're supposed to deal with the fact that Canada is openly doing eugenics against our community. Everyone I know is terrified for their lives and future. I thought it'd be useful to put that into the record of today's talk. But Ava has a question. Does anyone know of any individuals or organizations who are looking back through the shelved research? I feel like long-term care is like one example right now where it's like a really hot issue with reports that date back decades for how to fix the problem. Any other possible answers to Ava's question? Maybe they're just being shelved. Maybe we're not returning to them. Ellen might have a thought.
I know that there's a survivor library, mental health survivor library, and there are some people who have been looking back in through the history. I think there was there's actually problems with it now because a professor who was housing the consumer information and history left Boise, I believe it was, and they told them that they had to close the library and they had nowhere to store all of the research and all of the information that they had. So, I mean, stuff like that. There are people that continue to look back into mental health, and I'm one of those people who have many of the documents that came out in the 70s as mental health was dumping the hospitals and creating their plans. Every government had a new glossy thing. So yeah, so I know mental health does that, and the consumer movement in mental health does that, and it's needed.
Yeah, I was going to cite the consumer movement as well, because this is a group that does a lot of archival work and a lot of preservation, which is really important. Also, the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, online, they have a disability justice history timeline that relies on this kind of archival work too. And I think, you know, it's not to say that it doesn't happen. I think there are many researchers actively working right now to think through these histories of eugenics and institutionalization. I'm thinking, for example, of Jen, who's here, of Madeline Burghardt, of Kate Rossiter, of Claudia Malacrida, Jeffrey Rayum. There are a really strong handful of researchers in Canada who have their finger on the pulse of disability history. So attending to that work, I think, is significant as well.
My input would be, there's a book that's been published that chronicles the beginning of the independent living movement called Impact. It was written by a number of folks, but John Lord is the top author. So Impact. And then additionally, it is not a straight shot of disability, but intersected with disability. The University of Ottawa Library has an archive of the women's movement. And in that archive is some of the first pamphlets and things that Dawn had put out. I know this both because I'm centered in Ottawa and also part of Dawn. So it's predominantly women's history, but of course, because no one is just a gender or just a disability, there's some artifacts related to disability as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think that might conclude our Q&A and our panel. That is our very last panel in our virtual speaker series. I'm so deeply grateful and moved to have been, you know, I've had the privilege to moderate such excellent speakers. What a way to close off this series. My deepest gratitude to all three of you. I did want to note that Trina's asked in the chat how we keep the conversation going, how we keep in touch. Maybe I leave that to the group to figure out, but I did want to note that with our series closing, The Institute will be publishing recordings of each talk in the new year, so we can circulate email announcements about that to all the registrants to these panels. And I'll also note that I just put in the chat a call for papers. That does include my email address if you want to keep in touch with me or have me put you in touch with anyone who's been participating in this series. But the call for papers is one of the outputs to our project, where students, researchers, and activists are welcome to submit their own writing and thoughts on how we should be grounding disability research as a kind of directive for disability researchers in the future. Thank you everyone for joining and making this talk well attended and successful. What a lovely conversation that's been happening in the chat. Hopefully I'll see some of you by email. Otherwise, I think I do need to close off because we're past time. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jen.